Hey, thanks for tuning back in to this episode of Genuine Questions. I was inspired to make this video because I was watching a speech that Dinesh D'Souza was giving about these two big lies that are told to us as a society and why they're lies and why it's so easy for the people to believe them, especially when you have the influence of the mainstream media helping push these narratives. So Dinesh discusses two things in his speech. One is this notion that the Republican and the Democratic Party switched platforms around the 60s. And then he also talks about this notion that fascism is a right-wing ideology. I do want to discuss both of those lies in this video. And then I also want to talk about the lie that they are currently pushing on us, which is that voter ID laws are racist and anyone who supports them is a racist. So the first video that I'd like to start off with is just Dinesh discussing the broad concepts of what this video is going to be about and the topics that we're going to discuss today.
How do we know what we know? Or to put it somewhat differently, how is it that we come to know things that are in fact flatly untrue? The reason it's easy to believe a big lie is something like this. A professor or scholar writes a book, and the book argues an ideological narrative, which is then praised by other like-minded scholars, at which point it is then picked up by NPR, which does a little segment on it, and then it's favorably reviewed in the New York Review of Books, and pretty soon Michael Moore gets wind of it, and he strolls in elephantine fashion, and then decides to make a documentary, or the History Channel is at your door. And so for you, the citizen, the viewer, you're like, that's true because I read it over here, and it was reviewed over there, and then I heard it on NPR, and then I saw it out here, and then there it was on TV, and that's how I got to know it. Not realizing that what you have come to know is actually, you may say, the same intellectual bullet ricocheting off numerous walls and coming at you from different directions. Small lies are actually quite easy to detect. If someone makes a factual claim about you, your neighbor stole your car. Pretty easy to check. Go look in your garage. You still have your car? No, it's gone. Go look in his garage. But big lies are not like that, because big lies are not so easy to check. If somebody were to tell you that fascism is a phenomenon of the right, it is a right-wing phenomenon. This is actually something that many of us know to be true. But if pressed, we suddenly realize that we are on very wobbly ground. We don't really know what fascism even is. We're not sure what left and right even mean. That after World War II, a new generation of progressives in America were coming to power in the academy, in the media, in the entertainment world, in Hollywood. Now notice that these are the three big megaphones of our culture: scholarship, media, entertainment. And if you can get an idea to reverberate through all three, that's how you manufacture a big lie. And in fact, the lie doesn't have to be true. Even if you in the fourth row knew it was false, you couldn't do anything about it because you don't have a megaphone big enough to contradict this blaring noise that is coming at everybody from every direction. After World War II, the progressives who knew the intimate relations between fascism in America and fascism in Europe, they knew about this, but they didn't want you to know about it. And so a very interesting ideological operation got underway. It is an inconvenient truth that is recognized by ideological soulmates to be inconvenient. And therefore, there is a suppression of it. Let's just leave it out of the textbooks.
So that last line that Dinesh just says there about there is an ideological truth that has been recognized to be inconvenient by multiple powerful groups. When that happens, those are the things that get erased from history, left out of the textbooks, not discussed on the media. You can have your left-wing news and your right-wing news, and they're more than happy to take an argument and frame it where Republicans are going to blame Democrats and Democrats are going to blame Republicans, because that's how you divide and conquer, and it's easier to rule over a divided group of people than it is when they're all united against you. Then they can focus on what you're up to because they're not busy fighting with their neighbors. But neither news side will cover a story from an angle that is going to be inconvenient for both sides and expose corruption on both sides. Say something like Jeffrey Epstein. So this first lie that we're going to talk about that's being covered up at first seems like it's just inconvenient for the Democratic Party, but once we talk about the second lie regarding fascism, then we'll go back and put this into context to show how this next historical truth is actually inconvenient for all career politicians, not just one party. And that inconvenient truth is the fact that everything that we historically know to be racist, the KKK, Jim Crow laws, segregation, those were all put in place by members of the Democratic Party. And when you try to bring this up to people, they can't argue with that. It's a historical fact. So instead, they tell you this mythology that sometime around the 60s, there's not an exact date pinned down to it, but that the two parties switched. And that all the Democrats said, hey, we're going to be Republicans now. And the Republicans said, okay, we'll be the Democrats now. And they just basically switched platforms.
Every segregation law in the American South was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, and implemented by Democratic officials. There's no exception to this rule. The Democratic Party was the party of the slave plantation. It was the party of Jim Crow, of segregation, of racial terrorism, of the Ku Klux Klan. But where is that racism now? Isn't it true that the parties sort of changed? Wasn't there kind of a big switch? Didn't the parties someday trade platforms? In other words, didn't the cops become robbers and the robbers become cops? And wasn't all of this implicated with Nixon's Southern strategy, in which Nixon kind of went down south, put on a Southern drawl, convinced all the Southern racists to become Republicans?
Maybe my public school education failed me because I don't ever remember learning about this phenomenon where the two parties decided to switch places. And it makes even less sense when you hear Dinesh explain how that actually never really did happen. It was one person that switched and stopped being a Democrat and started voting with the Republican Party. There was one person that made the switch. So let's hear him talk about that.
And let's talk about, before we get to now, let's talk about the 60s. The two parties switched platforms. Really? When did this happen? What was the switch of platforms? Let's put it more concretely. When Abraham Lincoln defined slavery, he says that in its essence, slavery means this: you work, I eat. Slavery is stealing another guy's labor. That's what it is. That's why it's wrong. And Abraham Lincoln says, moreover, this is the philosophy of the Democratic Party. Not of the Southern Democrats, of all Democrats. When Lincoln talks about, you could call it, it's my term, not his, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the four bad guys of slavery, he names them. Tawney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision. Tawney he counts as a Southerner. Because Tawney's from Maryland, not exactly South, but nevertheless. Franklin Pierce, the former president, from New Hampshire, Northern Democrat. Buchanan, the sitting president, from Pennsylvania, Northern Democrat. Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's rival, who ran against him both in Illinois and then later for the presidency, from Illinois, Northern Democrat. Notice 3 of the 4 are Northern Democrats. The Northern Democrats were in bed with the South on slavery. Why? Because the big lie is that this is the crime of the South, when it is in fact the crime of the Democratic Party. Now, if slavery is you work, I eat, Lincoln defines the Republican Party. It's the opposite. What is it? Lincoln puts it really clearly. the hand that makes the corn has the right to put the corn in its own mouth. In other words, people have the right to keep their own stuff. We have to keep the fruits of our own labor. And so, here we go. Let's fast forward 150 years, and I ask you today, if you were to define the core principle of the Republican Party, is it not that the hand that makes the corn has the right to eat the corn? And if you had to define what the Democratic Party's operational strategy is, call it redistribution, call it the New Deal, call it whatever you want, but the basic idea, you work, I eat. There it is, almost as if time had stood still for all this time. How many of the racist Dixiecrats, in fact, became Republicans? And the answer is clear. One guy. Strom Thurmond. Racist Dixiecrat, became a Republican, and no one else did. All the other racist Dixiecrats lived and stayed and died and were lionized in the Democratic Party. There are Senate buildings named after them in D.C. today. There was no big switch. More Republicans proportionally voted for civil rights than Democrats did. If the Congress was made up entirely of Democrats, none of those laws would have passed. Not the Civil Rights Act of '64, not the Voting Rights Act of '65, not the Fair Housing Bill of '68. None of it.
There's really no historical evidence to support this narrative that the two parties switched places, other than the fact that in the 60s, the Democratic Party under President Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act. So people take that as an indication or some sort of proof that all of a sudden the Democrats just decided to stop being racist and started to want to help out minority communities. But the other way, maybe more cynical, but I think makes more sense with the broader picture that you can look at this, is that the Democratic Party was losing their political relevance. There is a quote that is alleged that President Johnson said that the reason that they decided to pass the Civil Rights Act was because they will have minorities voting Democrat for 200 years. And so here, I thought this was an interesting article about this quote because it is not on tape. The reason that we have heard about it is a historic biographer wrote it in one of her books. But if you go online, particularly to Snopes, they'll do a fact check on it and they'll say that it's not true because there's no proof that he actually said it. But I like the way that this person who wrote this article broke down that Snopes fact check. So I think it's very interesting and I would like to read it to you. One sentence often attributed to LBJ, which has gained great fame on the internet, is this: I'll have those voting Democratic for 200 years. This line is often trotted out to allege that the civil rights legislation LBJ pushed and ultimately signed was motivated not by altruism, but by a cynical ploy to lock up votes. But did LBJ really say that? Someone asked at our meeting. I said I believe the source of the quote was historian Doris Goodwin's biography of LBJ and that she was a pretty credible source, despite some plagiarism charges. But the source was not Goodwin, however. I had confused that LBJ quote with this one. These Negroes, they're getting pretty uppity these days, and that's a problem for us since they've got something now they have never had before, the political pool to back up their uppityness. Now we've got to do something about this. We've got to give them a little something. Just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference. The source of the 200 years quote is Ronald Kessler's 1995 book, Inside the White House. Kessler got the quote from Robert McMillan, an Air Force One steward who said LBJ uttered this comment to two governors during a conversation on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Snopes, a fact-checking website, states there's little evidence to back up the quote. It's a strange claim since Snopes admits the quote wouldn't have been entirely out of character for LBJ, and other sources corroborated many of the other juicy tidbits McMillan gave Kessler. So why doubt the quote's authenticity? Snopes brings into question Macmillan's veracity, noting that Lucy Baines Johnson, who is one of the president's daughters, flatly denied Macmillan's claim that when she was a teenager, she once screamed at him to go find her bleep, her servant, and threatened to slap him if he didn't. It must not have occurred to Snopes that many people would flatly deny such a claim. The fact-checking outfit, which has a notable left-leaning tilt, seems pretty concerned with defending the idea that LBJ's action on civil rights was anything but genuine idealism. They ignore or overlook the following facts to reach this conclusion. Kessler's source is historically sound and a first-hand account from an eyewitness. LBJ's paternal and racist rhetoric towards African Americans and his fondness of his use of the N-word is well documented, casts some doubt on the idea that his motivations on the civil rights were altruistic. Lucy Baines Johnson, who likely heard her father use racial epithets, would have motivation to deny any racist utterances she might have made. Goodwin's quote confirms that LBJ possessed a well-honed political calculus on the issue of civil rights. If LBJ said what Macmillan claimed, Macmillan's editorializing comments, which Snopes frowned upon, make sense. Macmillan used the words phony and ploy to characterize LBJ's motivations on the Civil Rights Act. Numerous historians have LBJ on the record referring to the Civil Rights Act of 1957 as the N-word bill, a phrase that runs counter to the altruism on civil rights. One can imagine LBJ saying what Macmillan claims he had said, especially if LBJ was trying to whip up support for his bill among reluctant Democrats. We will likely never know for certain if LBJ said what Macmillan claims, but Snopes' case falls short of casting serious doubt on the testimony of an eyewitness account. So based on the way that I think politics works and how things probably go down in Washington, D.C., when you look at the actions of politicians who never really do anything to make our lives better, but only to enrich themselves, I think it's more than likely that LBJ, as most politicians, would have been motivated by cynical power grabs than they would be for actually helping any minorities or the everyday man. Another thing that I was thinking about when I was driving home for Thanksgiving, I was listening to my iTunes on shuffle, and the song F the Police by NWA came up. There are widespread accounts of the LAPD being super racist. In the 80s, early 90s, you think about Rodney King. So then I got curious and thought, well, who's in charge of the LAPD? Who runs the city of Los Angeles? Because if we're going with this narrative that the parties switch places in the 60s, then things post-60s, all of these acts of racism would be done by members of the Republican Party. Because after the 60s, it's the Democrats who are the good guys. But I went and I looked up who the mayors of Los Angeles have been, because it's the mayor who runs the city police department, and all of the relevant years here, they were run by Democrats. So from the 60s, 70s, up until Rodney King, they were run by Democrats. And then we had a few years of a Republican, and then we've gone right back to Democrats. And then when you look at things like, Joe Biden, a member of the Democratic Party, who talks about not wanting his kids to grow up in a racial jungle and implements the crack versus cocaine sentencing disparities. And you hear people like Hillary Clinton referring to black teenagers as super predators. I'm just wondering, when exactly did these parties switch? When did the Democrats stop becoming racist or stop being racist? Because everything that I've seen in my lifetime that's definitely been post the civil rights era has still been Democrats cynically pandering to and exploiting minority communities without actually doing anything to improve their lives. So we're going to come back to this discussion about things being racist here in a minute, but I just want to do a little sidetrack on Dinish's other big lie that he discusses, which is the political ideology of fascism and that is strictly a right-wing concept.
What is fascism? A really good way to think about it is people say, well, Trump is a fascist because he's an authoritarian. He's against the democratic process. He wants to shut down dissent. Now, first of all, for anybody who turns on any media platform, I don't just mean the news, but the comedy channels or the Oscars or the Emmys or the late night shows, Trump is bashed on every medium every day, 24 hours a day. A real authoritarian, I think you know, would not put up with that. But even were Trump an authoritarian, let's say he was, that wouldn't make him a fascist. There have been authoritarians from the dawn of time. We have had innumerable monarchs and third world despots and authoritarian rulers, and it makes no sense to call them all fascists. That's not the essence of fascism at all. The mystery of fascism can be put this way. When we think of ideologies or powerful systems of thought that have influenced, for better or worse, large numbers of people, you can usually name their guiding philosopher. Who's the philosopher of capitalism? Adam Smith. Who's the philosopher of Marxism or socialism? Marx. Who's the philosopher of fascism? Dead silence. Why? Because that man, his ideas are not taught. And yet, the founding philosopher of fascism, just as Giovanni Gentile, regarded in his lifetime to be one of the most important philosophers in the West, Mussolini's Minister of Education, there's a reason that he's not taught now. And that's because when he defines fascism, he says that fascism is not what people say it is today. He says fascism is the ideology of the centralized state. Fascism means that the government, the state, controls the economy, state-directed capitalism, that's the economic definition of fascism, and the state regulates the private life, including the opinions and expressed thoughts of the citizens. Fascism, as I mentioned in its core concept, is the notion of the state regulating private industry. Fascism is a particular type of socialism. The fascists don't nationalize industries, but they tell them what to do. That's why fascism is state-run capitalism. Now, fast forward now to the Democratic Party now. And ask yourself, what is the policy of the Democratic Party today, of Obama, of Hillary, of Pelosi? It's not socialism, because they're not trying to nationalize industries the way that the Indian government did after independence. They're not trying to have the government take over the energy industry. Obama didn't take over the healthcare industry. We have private hospitals, we have private health insurance companies, but the Democrat strategy is for the government to control the private sector. And so even though we have private hospitals, the government is very influential in setting prices. The government tells you what services health insurance companies can offer and what they can't. This is, in a clinical sense, fascism. Real fascism isn't the fascism of the street. Yeah, Hitler had brown shirts. Yeah, Mussolini had black shirts. But the really dangerous fascism is what happened when the fascists came to power, which is that they would use the weapons of the government, which in our case means the FBI, the IRS, the CIA, the Justice Department, against their opponents. So this is a more disturbing use of the state.
So I think that's a really interesting way to summarize what fascism is, especially when you couple it with the previous video about what happened after World War II, where a lot of the leading fascist Nazi leaders did not get held accountable and were actually brought over to the United States and given pretty high levels of prestige in our government. Like Wernher von Braun heading up NASA is just one example. And then almost 20 years after that, when they have President Kennedy who comes into power and threatens to end the military-industrial complex and dismantle the CIA, a lot of these fascists get very upset and his head gets blown off. So pretty much ever since then, we have been living under what feels like democracy and seems like democracy because we have two parties and we vote and we have choices. But if you look through the trajectory of who the candidates have been on either side since Kennedy, it appears that they haven't really cared too much which candidate we pick because they are all tied in together of this deep state, cabal, career politicians, where they are really just looking out for their own best interests and are happy to have us fight amongst each other so they continue to rob us blind and get rich at our expense while doing nothing to help the people that elect them into office. And that is why I think that this historical fact about the DNC being responsible for the KKK, Jim Crow, segregation, that it is ideologically convenient for all sides to play along with this because right now, in the present day, I guess not right now, a few years ago, appeared that it was Donald Trump that was able to infiltrate the Republican Party, which is why then you saw the entire media, CIA, all these institutions of government, IRS, all go after Trump. Just like Dinesh says, that's what these fascists do when they pull all or have their hands on all the levers in government. They use these to go after their enemies. That's why Edward Snowden is hiding in Russia or something, because the NSA doesn't like that he blew the whistle on them. That's what happens to real whistleblowers who speak out and try to stand up against these oppressive governments. You don't get a primetime special on 60 Minutes and then a congressional hearing the very next day when you are a legit whistleblower like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange. You get persecuted by the government. And since they can't really run on their policies, they have been running on this notion that we have the moral high ground, and if you do not vote for the Democratic Party or you not vote against Donald Trump, then you're a bad person. And then when people bring up the fact that, well, historically, you're pretty bad people, the Democratic Party is pretty bad too. So why are you morally any better than voting Republican or voting for Trump? And then that's why they need that lie of, oh, well, the party switched places. It is clear that the media is operating at the behest of these career politicians, which is a textbook indicator of fascism. They openly discuss and advocate for censorship, another hallmark of fascism, and they smear their reputations and persecute their political enemies, all under the guise of doing these things for the greater good, which is word for word the justification that Hitler used. In fact, every historical example of some sort of authoritarian or fascist coming into power, they have always justified what they have been doing by saying it was for the greater good. And they've always been able to do that by manipulating the majority of people into believing that whatever they are doing is for the greater good. And they say that history repeats itself, and that if you don't know history, that you're doomed to repeat it. So I think that those are very important concepts and lessons that people should understand in the present day, because we did not eradicate evil from the world in the 1940s when we defeated Hitler. That ideology lingers, and we need to look out for it and be able to recognize it when it's happening and not only see it in hindsight when it's too late and millions of people have been murdered. So the last lie that I want to talk about is this narrative that's being pushed that voter ID laws are racist. So on its surface, I can understand this debate from both sides. If you are on the left, you would see it as this is Republicans who think that minorities always vote Democrat, so we are going to do things to stop Democrats from voting because that is going to help us win elections. That could be the case. Or if you're on the right, you would look at it from the perspective that the Democrats don't want voter ID laws so that way they can stuff the ballot box with as many votes as they need to win elections, and there's no way to verify if these votes are accurate because you don't have to provide any sort of ID in order to vote. Let's watch this news clip where they discuss what some of these laws actually are, and then that might help us decide which of these two scenarios is more likely.
The new law will now also require photo ID to request an absentee ballot, like voting in person.
It continues to, I think, will allow Georgia to have secure, accessible, fair elections.
But the White House says that could discourage elderly, poor, and minority voters, less likely to have government-issued IDs.
To intentionally, I believe, attempt to prevent whole populations of people from exercising their constitutional right to vote in their elections.
So personally, I find the whole concept that minorities can't get IDs and that's why voter ID laws are racist, I find that to be incredibly condescending and pretty racist in and of itself. Right here, the ACLU said in 2017, voter ID laws deprive many voters of their right to vote, reduce participation, and stand in direct opposition to our country's trend of including more Americans in the democratic process. Many Americans do not have one of the forms of identification states accept for voting. These voters are disproportionately low-income, racial and ethnic minorities, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Such voters more frequently have difficulty obtaining IDs because they cannot afford or cannot obtain the underlying documents that are a prerequisite to obtaining a government-issued photo ID card. They have never explained what these barriers are that stop minorities specifically from being able to obtain these documents or get to the BMV. I find it pretty condescending to assume that based on their race, they can't obtain those things, that they can't get the help that they need to do so. And in case it wasn't clear based on what the NAACP said, Joe Biden says here, reported on by CBS News, that voter ID requirements are an attempt to repress minority voting, masquerading as an attempt to end corruption.
The conservative majority upheld two Arizona laws. One made third-party ballot collection illegal, and the other tossed out votes cast in the wrong precinct. And the DNC fought both because they made voting harder for people of color. We all know this is nothing new. It is the ghost of Jim Crow.
If you're voting in the wrong precinct, then your vote shouldn't be counted. That's why we have precincts that you go vote in so they can break down these numbers into smaller groups, and it's easier to verify who people are and that they live in this area and that they should be voting there. So if you are voting in the wrong precinct, then no, your vote should not be counted, and I have no idea how anybody can seriously hear that and think that that is an attack on minorities. Is he implying that only minorities ever vote in the wrong precinct? Is that not something that anybody could make that mistake and do? Are they only throwing out the minority votes that were cast in the wrong precinct and allowing white people's votes that are cast in the wrong precinct to do that? How is that racist? That, to me, that does seem like a voter integrity issue. When that guy was speaking, he was actually the opening act for a Kamala Harris speech that she gave about voter rights. And mostly I just want people to hear how phony she sounds when she talks about this. She sounds like such a stereotypical politician just saying these cookie cutter lines that have no substance and mean nothing at all, but is telling you how racist everyone else is. And she sounds like such a phony cheese ball when she says it.
In 2020, you were heard, America. You were heard loud and clear. In the midst of a global crisis, more Americans voted than ever before. But there is another side to this story. So far this year, 17 state legislatures have enacted 28 new laws that will make it harder for Americans to vote. And let's talk about what exactly these laws will do. What will they actually do? Well, these laws create obstacle upon obstacle. These laws make it harder for you to vote because they don't want you to vote. Your vote matters. Your voice matters. Your will matters. Your desire for yourself and your families matters. So we want to help you vote. And we want to help to make sure your vote is counted.
2 comments about what she said there. First, I love how she opens it where she wants to have it both ways, that more Americans than ever voted, yet we also had massive cases of voter suppression. How can you take someone seriously who praises the highest voter turnout in American history and then in their very next breath goes on to talk about how there was unprecedented voter suppression? And then another thing that I have questioned when I've been hearing these 2 competing sides over the voter ID debate is I don't hear anybody on the left discussing voter education, how to teach people which precinct to vote in or how to fill out their ballots correctly, or some sort of outreach program to help these people who can't get government-issued IDs to help get them to the BMV so they can get one. I have never heard any solutions that come from that end of the spectrum. It is always just don't have voter ID laws because you're racist if you do, with no acknowledgement of this other side of the argument that, yes, that can lead to voter fraud if you don't require people to prove their identity before they vote. And I don't know how people don't see through that. Vox published a study that I was actually surprised that they published this because Vox usually tends to skew to the left. A major study finds that voter ID laws hurt minorities isn't standing up well under scrutiny. It was supposed to be the study that proved voter ID laws are not just discriminatory, but can also have a big impact on elections. And it was picked up widely with outlets including Think Progress and the Washington Post reporting that the study found voter ID laws hurt Hispanic voters in particular and skewed elections to the right. But a follow-up study suggests the findings in the original were bunk. According to researchers at Stanford, Yale, and the University of Pennsylvania, the original study was based on surveys of voters that are extremely unreliable, skewing the results. On top of that, several calculation errors led to even more problems. When the errors are corrected, the follow-up researchers found there is no evidence in the analyzed data that voter ID laws have statistically significant impact on voter turnout. In other words, it's possible that voter ID laws still have an impact on elections, but the original study just doesn't have the data to prove it. So I guess that's why Vox is publishing it, because even though there's absolutely no data to prove this, they still throw in little lines like that, suggesting, it might still be true, we just have absolutely no reason to think it, based on the evidence. The follow-up study is careful to note that stricter voter ID laws may reduce turnout, particularly among minorities, but the evidence presented in the original study does not constitute reliable information documenting such a relationship. The findings present an ongoing academic debate, so it's hard to say where it will ultimately land. Just like the original study was not the final say on voter ID laws' effect on turnout, the new follow-up study will not be the final say on this research either. There may be problems in the follow-up study that will be exposed by another follow-up study, especially given that it was not peer-reviewed. But this is how science works. It's part of a continual process in which errors are called out and fixed over time, and human understanding creeps closer and closer to clarity, hopefully in the future, perfection. I wanted to make sure I included that part of the article too, because just given what's going on today with other issues going on where you're not allowed to question science, I like how this article outlines what the scientific process is, which is you do double check and question and have people test your work instead of just taking everybody at their word. Whatever the ultimate critiques of the follow-up study, its findings generally back up the large overall research on voter ID laws. Though voter ID laws do limit people's ability to vote in some cases and have historically been used to target voters of color, the laws seem to have a tiny effect on current elections. That might be surprising considering all the headlines about voter ID laws in the past few years. People without ID are less likely to vote than other registered voters. The North Carolina study found that 43% of the unmatched voters, registered voters who could not be matched with a driver's license, participated in 2012, compared with more than 70% of matched voters. Essentially, the numbers of voters who don't actually have an eligible ID is very inflated by estimates like Pennsylvania's, and assuming that these people will vote in the first place is a big mistake. They're less likely to vote with or without a voter ID law. There's no question that voter ID has a disparate impact on Democratic-leaning groups, those young, non-white, poor, immobile, or elderly voters. But 22% of those voters were registered Republicans. The voters without an identification might be breaking something more like 70-30 for Democrats than 95-5. A 70-30 skew is still a big loss for Democrats, but when taking into account that many of these people are unlikely to vote in the first place, the total count of lost voters is much smaller than one would think. Studies looking into voter ID laws' effect on voter turnout back this up. This research, including multiple studies conducted over several years, has generally found that voter ID laws have little to no impact on voter turnout, even when looking at specific racial groups. What this article is saying is that there was one study that said voter ID laws super racist. When someone went to peer review it, they found there's a whole bunch of errors with the way that this study was done that were going to skew the results in that direction. So they fixed the model and redid it and found that voter ID laws don't really have a huge impact on election outcomes, because if you don't have an ID, you're probably not going to go vote anyways. It's not like all these people out there who would just be dying to vote, but they just can't get there because they don't have an ID. Those are the type of people that would have stayed home and not participated in the process anyways. So overall, they actually have a very small effect on voter turnout, and it is not targeting people based on race. So given the information that's available to me, I have a hard time believing the left's narrative that voter ID laws are designed to prevent minority people from voting. It also doesn't make sense because it's my understanding that the Republican Party had their highest turnout of minority voters, I think, in history. So why they would not want to expand on that newfound support as opposed to just make sure that minority people can't vote anymore, that doesn't make sense to me. I'm more inclined to agree with the people on the right who think that not having any voter ID rules is going to open us up to election fraud. And I know that people say that historically there's no evidence of election fraud. All of that is going to be the subject of the next video. I just want to finish up with this last video of Ted Cruz, where he is discussing how the Democrats are trying to take these laws that make it easier to vote that we put in place temporarily because there was a global pandemic, how the Democrats are trying to take those laws and make them permanent.
DOJ has also said under the Biden administration that it is not going to presume that a state acts lawfully if it simply returns to pre-COVID voting laws. What does that tell you if they say after a pandemic, if you go back to the laws that existed before, DOJ is not going to assume that that's okay? What does that tell you about the partisan nature of DOJ?
It says to me that what they would like to do is make permanent the emergency procedures that were instituted by many states through litigation by the DNC throughout the country prior to the 2020 election. And so rather than understand that they are temporary, they are going to go after states that designed to go back to their original election procedures.
And I think they also think Democrats did well under those emergency procedures. And so keeping those emergency procedures in place will predictably benefit Democrats.
Say what you want about Ted Cruz. He's certainly not my favorite person in Washington, but I think he hit the nail on the head with that one. That preventing these voter ID laws and getting rid of this widespread mail-in balloting that's very hard to check the identities of the people that are voting, that when you get rid of those safeguards, that is something that is going to benefit Democrats. That there is a stronger case for that narrative being made than there is that requiring people to show their ID when they vote to prove their identity is going to disenfranchise minorities. But as Dinesh says, when you have the mainstream media, academia, all of these entertainment, all of these cogs in our society, all pushing this same narrative, blasting this in your face constantly that voter ID is racist, it's hard to see the other side of it. You have to go look for what the other side of it is. And I hope that I am alive long enough to see the news restored to its former credibility, where we can actually have some faith and confidence in what they are telling us and not always have to question if the news is another one of these big lies that is being pushed at the behest of the powerful, which I think is a pretty genuine question that we need to be asking ourselves every time we turn on the TV.